Il y a un mois, commençaient les massacres de l'armée israélienne dans la bande de Gaza. Des frappes destinées officiellement à détruire le Hamas après son attaque contre Israël le 7 octobre, mais qui tuent, qui blessent et déplacent des milliers de civils palestiniens. Bilan des bombardements, 10 500 morts et des millions de déplacés palestiniens. Comment en est-on arrivé là et est-on parti pour un conflit sans fin? Bienvenue dans le Scan, l'émission d'actualité de Tel Quel. Notre invité aujourd'hui est Farid Abdelnour. Il est professeur de sciences politiques à l'université de San Diego, en Californie.
For you, Professor, when was the last time you saw or recalled a month this painful and this bloody for the Palestinians?
I don't recall a month this painful and this bloody. I thought we had seen something pretty awful in 2014 when over 2,200 Palestinians were killed in the Israeli attack of Gaza at that time, over 52 days. And now we're seeing over 9,000 in a few weeks. So the scale of this is pretty unprecedented. The Israeli response to the events of October 7th started by saying no water, no electricity, no fuel, no food can enter Gaza, where population is literally being punished. Like, you misbehaved, right? And now you're going to be punished. Palestinian people in Gaza are being subjected to state-sponsored torture. The state-sponsored torture of more than 2 million people is what we're witnessing.
A lot of people have drawn the parallel between Ukraine and Palestine. How do you account for this contrast and the response to sanctions imposed on Russia after its invasion of Ukraine and the absence of any sanctions against Israel?
The contrast between the European and American reactions to these two conflicts are a revelation of the utter moral bankruptcy of these countries that presume to speak in the name of human rights, presume to speak in the name of democracy, definitely betraying the ideal of democracy, betraying human rights as they use them in their discourse.
Arab countries have been calling out for this double standard you mentioned. Why does the Occident not see the same things when confronted with the same images? We're talking about Ukraine, we're talking about other countries who have faced occupation.
If you observe popular responses to these to what's going on in Palestine today, people from societies that are themselves settler colonial societies, or societies that are accustomed to be colonizers, that being a colonizer is part of their history and it's something they've absorbed, digested, and accepted about themselves. If they haven't come to terms with it critically, those segments of the society that have not come to terms with the history of colonialism critically, of course, identify with the colonizer. They don't identify with the colonized. And segments of the society that have begun to come to terms with their own colonial history know how to identify with the colonized. When you speak of the Arabic-speaking peoples, they have experienced colonialism. They have been colonized. And the colonized know the nature of the grievance that Palestinians have.
How much responsibility do you attribute to the Western world in the ongoing conflict historically and especially now?
Let's just single out Britain and the United States and their role, and then the United Nations in its early years, right after the war, and especially around the year 1947. These are the most direct ways in which the Western world, as you're calling it, is complicit in the horrors that have been perpetrated against the Palestinian people for the last 75 years. And now Britain's role is even older. Of course, Britain, I don't need to remind you or your audience of the Balfour Declaration, but sometimes we do need to be reminded that at a time when the overwhelming majority of the population of Palestine was Muslim and Christian, and the Jewish population of Palestine was a very small minority, Britain supported the idea of establishing a Jewish state in Palestine, or a Jewish homeland as they called it at the time, against the interests and wishes and expressed wishes of the overwhelming majority of the Palestinian population. The Balfour Declaration, I just want to remind you, mentions the Palestinian people, doesn't mention the Palestinian people, but the people living in Palestine, the overwhelming population, as having civil and religious rights, but it omits mentioning their political rights. Political rights are reserved, in other words, the right to self-determination is reserved to the Jewish people who overwhelmingly were not in Palestine at the time. So the right of self-determination is denied to the people living on the land. It is granted to people who only in small numbers were on the land at the time. So that crime, the Balfour Declaration, is really a historical crime perpetrated against the Palestinian people, and then the British mandatory authorities' implementation, really, of the Balfour Declaration over the mandatory years, especially until the year 1939. We can say that it actively did everything to try to realize that goal up to 1939. It's a stain on the conscience of the British state. The United Nations role was also detrimental in its early years. May I remind you that the United Nations was made up of largely colonial powers or small states that were beholden to the colonial powers. The United Nations in 1947 isn't the United Nations of today. So getting a 2/3 majority vote in the General Assembly at the time in support of the very unfair partition plan that the United Nations was proposing was one way in which the United Nations, which was the instrument of the colonial powers, and the United States playing a very important role at the time to twist arms and put pressure on countries so that they vote in support of it, of course, is responsible for triggering the civil war in Palestine that started the Nakba. Because really, you can think of the Nakba as really starting with the civil war that was triggered with the UN partition plan at the end of November 1947. So, and the United States' role has been so detrimental in this conflict, so detrimental. Maybe one of the worst things the United States did vis-a-vis to the Palestinians was its role in the so-called peace process. Because Palestinians dared to trust the United States. Now we can say that the Palestinian leadership may have been foolish, may have been naive to trust the United States, but the United States betrayed that trust from the beginning. Acted as a dishonest broker in the peace negotiations, and what that process bequeathed to the Palestinians was disaster. So it's just important to remember that this process that was supported by the United States, where it pretended to be an honest broker, is a process that led to the dismemberment of the West Bank and the creation of areas A, B, and C. That in 1994, it was Oslo II, right? And that became a permanent situation where Palestinians now are concentrated into Area A and some in Area B, and are actively being pushed out of Area C, which makes up the bulk of the West Bank. So this disastrous situation that caused the collapse, really, of the Palestinian economy and has had devastating effects economically, socially, culturally, politically, on the hope of having a contiguous Palestine in the West Bank. This can all be put at the door of the United States policy. It has had. So, I'm sorry, this was a very long answer. There's much more to say on this. I'm afraid the complicity is deep and long. I heard a very important historian say this recently, and so I credit him with that. Osama Maqdisi. He says to decontextualize and dehistoricize Palestinians' experience is the same thing as to dehumanize them. Their dehumanization begins by depriving them of their history. That gives meaning to their situation.
What do you anticipate in the upcoming days? Even if it's very hard and unpredictable what's happening right now, but where do you see things heading from now?
I don't think Israel will try to literally exterminate the people of Gaza. I don't think that's the kind that it's not like going to engage in the kind of genocide that will lead to the extermination of the people of Gaza. I don't think it will do that. But I think from the beginning of this campaign, Israel has been trying to send the message, and it will continue to send the message, that large-scale genocide is actually an option. It wants to remind everybody who cares to listen, everybody who thinks you can push Israel, it wants to remind them it actually has it in its power and could, if it wanted, engage in large-scale genocide. I think this is what we're witnessing. We're witnessing a demonstration of what's possible. And that's terrifying.
Yeah.
Another terrifying scenario, of course, is the scenario many people we are witnessing already the beginning of it. Now that half of the population of Gaza has been told to evacuate and move to southern Gaza, making one of the most densely populated places on earth now doubly densely populated. I think Israel will be looking for excuses and rationalizations to push Palestinians out of Gaza, or at least significant numbers of them, into the Sinai Peninsula. I know Egypt has spoken very strongly about how it will not accept that, etc., and that's very important that Egypt has taken this stance. I don't think that's the end of that line of thinking for the Israelis. I think they have such plans, like all states have multiple plans. They don't always act on them. This plan exists. We know about it. It's been leaked. They admit it. And we should not underestimate their willingness to implement it. So I think a continuation in a more intense way of the ethnic cleansing of Palestine is also another fear I have. That possibility is there. And I don't think, I think Israel might be testing the water about how much can it do without getting overwhelming opposition. Before October 7th, if you look back at the ratio, the kill ratio of Israelis and Palestinians, for the 15 years before October 7th, 20 Palestinians were killed for every Israeli who was killed. We're now at somewhere between 6 and 7 Palestinians for every Israeli. Here's my fear. My fear is that they're waiting for that ratio to reestablish itself. They're waiting for 28,000 Palestinians to be killed before they are comfortable with a re-established ratio of 20 to 1. They don't know this. They don't necessarily know this consciously. but subconsciously, they have been comfortable with that ratio. They have been comfortable with the idea that a Palestinian life is worth 5% of an Israeli life. And Palestinian life is still more than 5% since October 7th. They're not doing the calculation, but something in them will kick in to say, oh no, I think that's too far.
Are there any states or international organizations that are truly capable of playing a role of a mediation in this conflict? And yeah, if so, which ones?
Those who would be capable of not being dishonest brokers. Those who are capable of being honest brokers will be immediately rejected by Israel. So that's a bigger question you're asking for the future. I don't want to dismiss it. But I feel like before we start asking who would be the honest broker, we have to also start thinking about what are the changes that would have to take place for the two peoples to be in a situation where they can live with one another in peace and dignity. A just peace and dignity. And that all requires beginning from the assumption that they are people who deserve equal consideration. Unfortunately, we're nowhere near that. Even in discourse, we're nowhere near that. And anything, mediated or unmediated, that does not begin from that very elementary point, that nobody's interests take priority over anybody else's interests. We have two peoples with equal interests whose destinies are intertwined. Neither of these two peoples is going to be able to live without the other. They have to live together. The question is always, under what conditions will they live together? What we know is that the status quo ante, the status quo before October 7th, is simply unsustainable. That's not a life for anyone. In thinking about Palestine, it's important to distinguish between two forms of violence. There's the type of violence that we are seeing, that we saw on October 7th, and we are continuing to see now, and have seen since. It's the violence that's spectacular in a sense. It's the violence that shocks us all, right? There's another kind of violence. It's the slow, everyday violence. The violence of putting people in an open-air prison. The violence of calibrating how much water they get, how much food they get. It's the violence of stopping them from being able to have a future. So, violence has a quieter version that people don't get outraged by. When Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, B'Tselem, the United Nations human rights bodies speak of apartheid as the system that's in place in all parts of Israel-Palestine that the State of Israel controls, what they're talking about is a form of violence. Occupation, the rules of occupation are violence. Siege is violence. That violence is not okay for Palestinians to live under. They have been suffering from it for decades.